Welcome to today's video on the poem Tissue by Imtiaz Dharker. You'll need your copy of the anthology or something to make notes. So let's start by reading the poem through. If you can turn to page 42 and read along for me, please. Tissue. Paper that lets the light shine through. This is what could alter things. Paper thinned by age or touching, the kind you find in well-used books, the back of the Quran, where a hand has written in the names and histories, who was born to whom, the height and weight, who died where and how, on which sepia date, pages smoothed and stroked and turned transparent with attention. If buildings were paper, I might feel their drift, see how easily they fall away on a sigh, a shift in the direction of the wind. Maps, too. The sun shines through their borderlines, the marks that rivers make, roads, rail tracks, mountain folds, fine slips from grocery shops that say how much was sold and what was paid by credit card might fly our lives like paper kites. An architect could use all this, place layer over layer, luminous script over numbers over line, and never wish to build again with brick or block, but let the daylight break through capitals and monoliths, through the shapes that pride can make, find a way to trace a grand design with living tissue, raise a structure never meant to last, of paper, smoothed and stroked and thinned to be transparent, turned into your skin. So here's some images that you can link up to the lines in the poem. I'd like you to have a look and a read through and match up the imagery here to the line or sentence in the poem that it applies to. This will help you to gather quotations that you can discuss in your responses. Before we look at the poem in detail, let's have a look at some context about Ms. Dharker. So she was born in Pakistan, but moved to Glasgow in Scotland as a baby, so has spent a predominant amount of time in our Western society. However, she's heavily influenced by her own upbringing and is interested in multicultural issues as a result of that, and her marriage to her husband, who was Welsh. She likes to think about how this multicultural society impacts women, children, and general modern life. Her poem often reflects on change and kind of philosophical thinking about how the world could be improved or bettered as a result of potential change. Dharker spends much of her time in India and has written poetry about the dangerous nature of living in structures that are unsafe and flimsy, such as the types of shanty towns and things pop up, villages and towns that emerge in industrialised areas. Dharker also has a daughter. Some people have suggested that the final line in the poem, where she uses a direct address, is actually aimed towards her daughter in particular to kind of bolster her to make a difference herself in the real world. Now, rather than my usual chunking of the poetry into stanzas, I feel that the enjambment through this poem makes it easier to section it off in chunks. So we're going to look at it in three pieces and talk about how that interrelate with each other, the stanzas three. So the first thing to look at is the title. In particular, this title is ambiguous again in that it can have more than one meaning. So tissue can relate to lots of different things. So it can be literally tissue paper, or a piece of paper that is tissue, or we can think about tissue as in our skin. Both of these interpretations are covered in this poem, and sometimes very similar descriptions of each. So let's have a look at line 1 onwards. So we have paper that lets the light shine through. So this is the first instance that we're talking about a specific type of tissue, and here we're talking about paper. If it lets the light shine through, we know that light imagery encourages positivity and hopefulness, and if the light is shining through, it tells us that this particular paper is thin and delicate and almost translucent or transparent. It cannot be transparent, although if it is letting the light shine through, it's not necessarily glass, but it is thin enough for us to see through it. And then we're told this is what could alter things. So this ability to let the light shine through could alter things. Now that's quite philosophical, and it's obviously insinuating that if things need to be altered, then change is needed, and that links into that context about her thinking about change and what is needed in the world to improve. Then we're told paper is thinned by age or touching, the kind you find in well-used books, the back of the Quran. So here we're talking about paper in books, paper that is touched. And we know that if we touch paper, especially old paper, too much, the chemical from our fingertips, from the moisture, can eventually eradicate and erode paper, which is why in certain museums and libraries with the really precious original text, they wear gloves and they keep the books in really precious conditions so that the acidity doesn't erode the paper. And yet here we have paper that has been thinned by age or touching. It's precious, it's well used, it's well loved. And specifically here we have a religious text, so the Quran, which is specific to Islam, which of course is Miss Dharker's own religion. Then we move to what is contained within this precious, well-loved book. And it says here where a hand has written in the names and histories, who was born to whom, the height and weight, who died where and how, on which sepia date. So again, somebody has taken the time to record this information in this well-loved and precious book. Things like documents, though, are also included on paper, so birth certificates, death certificates, babies' weights and heights are recorded by health visitors in the early stages of their lives to ensure that they're growing properly. So we document all aspects of our own lives, marriage certificates, divorce certificates, etc. The whole of society relies upon paper in the form of documentation as evidence of our existence. So perhaps here she's speculating about how almost nonsensical it is that the most important documents in our life are on something that is so fragile and so delicate, that perhaps we put too much strength in paper when actually, ironically, it's quite delicate and quite weak. The sepia date as well suggests time and age, because sepia is a kind of browning that happens to documents after they've been in the sunshine or exposed in the air, and it's part of that kind of aging process then as well. So that brings us to the last part of this section. So we have these pages that are sepia have been smoothed and stroked and turned transparent with attention. So the attention has been so attentive, so regular, so gentle, so detailed, that this thinning of this paper has occurred due to the repetitive nature of it being held and touched and caressed. This shows severe care and affection here. It's something that's very sentimental, something that's very precious. at this point, this particular paper that documents and holds and contains lives. So section 2 now. If buildings were paper, I might feel their drift. See how easily they fall away on a sigh, a shift in the direction of the wind. So this single stanza at the beginning of this section encapsulates the idea about building with paper. Paper moves and shifts, so paper is delicate and light. It's also flexible, so if buildings were built with a fragile material like paper, they would fluctuate in the wind, they would move with the environment around it. This could link contextually to Dharker's time and experience around kind of delicate, fragile shanty buildings that aren't stable, but are easily removed, picked up and relocated, that perhaps living an existence that is able to react and move and shift with nature and work with nature might give you a more kind of transient sense of life rather than putting down roots and being fixated in one place. So she could be making some kind of statement here about the flexibility of life in comparison to the kind of static existence of bricks and mortar. It is an isolated stanza as well because it is a single stanza with a full stop at the end, so there's no enjambment here. So this idea of building with paper and about creating with paper is encapsulated in just this single stanza. So following on from that, we have then this idea of maps. So we have this very simple sentence, maps to. Now, maps are something that are constructed and laid out by humanity. They are crafted by humans, and it is about power and control over an area. Then we have, so it's quite a short, simple sentence to kind of make that effective statement at the beginning about maps and their construction. Then we have the sun shines through their borderlines. So the sun represents nature. Nature is not constrained or controlled by a border. It can flow freely across boundaries that are created by humanity. It has the freedom to be able to move where and when it wants. Then we have the marks that rivers make, roads, rail tracks, mountain folds. Now, rivers can also cross boundaries, okay? Rivers flow freely like nature. However, that's then juxtaposed next to roads, rail tracks and mountain folds. So this listing of 3 things that are human constructs. Roads are built by humans, rail tracks are built by humans, mountains, folds moving through and over and around mountains. It's all human constructs here. And some of these things cross boundaries, but they're still needed to be controlled when they reach those edges. So it's all about how humans have tried to control nature and tried to restrict and change it. And that's all documented on these maps. We put borders on our existence. So again, she might be making a statement here about how paper, how maps control our lives, and yet nature is free. And this contrast here between the power of nature and the power of humanity might make us rethink the need for those things. Then the final stanza in this section that we're going to look at here in the orange section says, find slips from grocery shops that say how much was sold. So slips of paper from grocery shops that tell us how much was sold are obviously receipts. And if you keep a receipt, it is evidence of what you have purchased. It will inform you about how much money you have spent. And again, it's a form of kind of control and dictating what we need. This could be a symbol of capitalism and our need to purchase and make things out of money, which also money appears in the form of banknotes, which is another form of paper. What was paid by credit card might fly our lives like paper kites. So if it's flying our lives like paper kites, that's a simile here Talking about finances again, this simile is about control here, and yet the sense of feeling freedom. So if we break the simile down, what was paid by credit card might fly our lives like paper kites. So a credit card gives you a sense of freedom. You're not constrained by how much money you have in your bank account. You can make a purchase and borrow money from the bank and the government to make that purchase. It gives you a feeling, an imagining of the freedom of financial restriction. However, if we break this simile down a bit, I've drawn you a little picture. I know how much you love those. The kite, although it is flying freely, is still on the end of a piece of string being held by somebody, and that person can control the kite. So in this simile is very clever, this imagining you are the kite, feeling the sense of freedom that you have from your constraints financially, with your financial money and your statements, and yet you are being controlled by the bank or the government who have loaned you that money, and you have to pay interest on it. So actually, you might have a sense of feeling free, but you are still under control. So now let's have a look at the third and final section. At the beginning on line 25, we have an architect could use all this, place layer over layer. So an architect is somebody that builds things and designs things. They create. This could be a metaphor for creation of the future and the type of future that we should be building. Remember, she's quite philosophical about the future and what is needed to be planned and constructed. And here we're saying they could use all that's gone before to place layer over layer. Now that layer over layer is repetition, so it's about levels, just like paper is placed one on top of the other to build some kind of stack. Then we have luminous script over numbers over line. Now the word luminous talks about light, so it's the use of light imagery here, which is also replicated in the next stanza with the daylight breakthrough. So when we talk about light, we know that that represents hope and change and the future and the goodness in the world. So she's saying here that this architect, the person that should be building the future, should be using light and never wish to build again with brick or block. So it's about change. It's about not using what's gone before and just sticking to routine, but thinking about adaptability and what we need to insert into the world to make it better. But let the daylight break through the capitals and monoliths, through the shapes that pride can make. So we need to let more light in, the hope and the change to break through these capitals, these monoliths, these constructs that are mostly for decoration. A monolith is a statue, as you saw in the imagery in the second slide earlier on. They are just built to show off, to represent something, a lot like the statue in Ozymandias in the other poem. It's about pride, it's about arrogance, and it's not needed. We should be building things because they're needed and they're useful rather than to show off. So then we're told we need to find a way to trace a grand design with living tissue. So here, if we're going to find a way, we need hope. This is about the future. A grand design as well needs to be bold. It's really important. It needs to be big. It's applying a certain amount of pressure about the future here. But we're told to build that with living tissue. So here we're talking about skin, we're talking about humanity, and we need to use the best of ourselves, our human life, to build this grand design, to build this future. We need to raise a structure never meant to last. Humanity isn't going to last forever, much like the statue didn't in Ozymandias. We are mortal, but we need to make the best of ourselves and our lives while we have them. Again, we were told in the context earlier that she has a child, and if you are going to make a grand design with living tissue, it's about being a mother or a father or a parent and creating a future in a human form. It's about giving birth, about putting something better than yourself out into the world. Then we have a paper smoothed and stroked and thinned to be transparent. So this is a repetition of that idea that was used earlier about the paper on the page being smoothed and thinned because we care for it. And here, the living skin, the tissue, is being smoothed and stroked and thinned. It's about caring for humanity, about caring for loved ones. And your skin too, as you age, thins and becomes more transparent and wrinkles because it loses its elasticity. It's about aging, and it's about the fact that we do age, and that's what makes life so precious, is that eventually it will end. And then this final single line stanza at the end is turned into your skin. Okay, so we are what's gone before. We are all the love, all the care that we have received in our lifetimes and that we can pay forward. The turned into your skin here, the use of the pronoun your, is a form of direct address. Is she talking directly to her own child, to her daughter, or is she talking to the reader? Is this poem an instruction about what we need to care about, what we should put our faith in? How paper can be used to control, but also to document love and affection, how our bodies are used. Should we be building structures? Should we be actually caring for each other? There's lots and lots of ideas in this poem, and it's about finding what you think is best through it. Now that we've looked through the poem, you'll need to complete an amity on this poem. So that's the about, what the poem's about, the mood, and whether this shifts or changes through the poem. Ideas, so any themes that are apparent or are mentioned, or intentions the poet might have with regards to those themes. 3 techniques, please, which will be quotations and their meaning. And then finally, your response on the poem. Once you've collected all that information together, you will have everything you need. We just need to look at which other poems you might make links with in the assessment. So there's Ozymandias, which also shows the power of nature over humanity and talks about the negative aspect of pride and arrogance. The Emigre also deals with the power of identity, but also femininity, because it is a female perspective, much like the mother's perspective in this poem. Poppies as well, another female perspective, so discusses ideas about femininity and family, as well as the power of identity in those roles. Prelude deals with the power of nature over humanity, in that this particular event shapes and changes his future and his identity as a result of nature. Then Kamikaze also deals with the power of nature and how that shapes your present and your future, with the decision that he makes as a result of what he sees in nature below him. And also the power of family, or lack of power through familial ties in Kamikaze because of his decision. Checking out my history as well is also about the power of humanity and identity, how he grows up, what he's told, and how that influences his life as well as his past. Thank you for listening.